Hello and welcome to The Federal. You're watching Off the Beaten Track, a program in which we speak about one single issue in depth with a subject specialist. We will today be talking about a very important issue of Indian society and politics, that is caste, which keeps on being discussed all the time. It keeps on figuring in politics without people really having a full notion of how far back does caste go, what is the really the lines of separation of Indian society, where all are castes available, how does caste play out differently in different regions of India. I will essentially be talking about caste through the prism of two individuals who stand with contradictory and often conflicting positions on caste. Mahatma Gandhi on one hand, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on the other. On the other side, I am also going to be placing two ideas, two ideologies. One is actually an ideology, that is the ideology of Hindutva, and the other is the social reality of caste. Quite often, we have seen in the last 3.5, 4 decades, ever since the forces of Hindu nationalism have come to the political fore, there has been an intense debate between the notions of Ambedkar and Gandhi, both of whom are being appropriated falsely by the Sangh Parivar and other Hindu nationalists, as well as we find a conflict going on between Hindutva and caste because Hindu consolidation across caste lines gets broken by caste division. That is one of the reasons as to why it keeps on surfacing in Indian politics. Now, I am going to be talking about this intensely complicated but also fairly simple issue and never fading issue of caste with Professor Surinder S Jodhka, who is a professor of sociology at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is an eminent academic, someone who has actually studied this issue very consistently over the last several decades in his academic career. Welcome to the program, Professor Jodhka, for sparing time and joining us on this program. Let me congratulate you for having such trying to attempt a complex discussion. Congratulate you for this very fine anthology which you have co-edited along with Yules Node, another scholar. Let me flash the book once again. This is it. It's the Oxford Handbook of Caste. So essentially, the moment you read a handbook of any subject, essentially it means A to Z. Anyone who is interested in the serious aspects and trying to really comprehend and understand caste in all its various dimensions, please get hold of a book and do read it. It's a fairly thick book, as you would see, and fairly daunting reading. But yes, trust me, even if it'll take a long time, but if you start reading it, you'll be able to unravel and get a better understanding of how political leaders constantly keep on misusing the idea of caste and caste identity. Professor Jodhka, thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on the show. And thank you also for introducing the book. This has just come out from Oxford University Press. It has 42 chapters apart from our introduction and 7 section introductions. So it's taken us nearly 5 years to complete this volume, and it has scholars literally from all over the world who have been working on the subject of caste. They are all working on India or South Asia. I mean, one can talk about caste in other contexts as well, but this book is primarily about the realities of caste in contemporary India, in past, in medieval times, and various aspects of it. Thank you once again for having me on the show.
Yes, you've really accomplished a daunting task of getting the who's who of people who are competent authorities and personalities who have actually engaged with this very complex issue of caste. Let me begin our discussion with you by talking about a very simple subject, which is actually caste in Indian society. There's one phrase which struck, in what we call the editor's introduction right in the beginning of the book, where it comes across that caste is actually not a matter of faith, whereas in India, everything is a matter of faith, whether we talk about Ayodhya being the birthplace of Ram, that is also a matter of faith, whether Krishna being part of the name of the official and the actual name of Mr. Lal Krishna Advani or not, even that is a matter of faith. So there are various kinds of issues involved with matters of faith in India. Caste is historically, how does it evolve? From a very layman's understanding of how you approach the subject, it appears that it is not that something caste has existed in till it right from ancient past of Indian society. Rather, the way in which we see it manifesting now is essentially a fairly modern, or at least sometime in the medieval era, manifesting itself.
See, I think it's a very good question the way you put it. I think that's a good point to start as well. Caste is also a matter of faith. That we have, in some sense, classical Brahminical Hinduism, where it is a matter of faith. But the point that our introduction is trying to make, and through my own work, that it is also more than just being a matter of faith.
Right.
There are several reasons for that. People who don't have the Hindu hierarchical culture, like in my own community, that's where I started working on. Sikhism
Right.
doesn't really believe in the idea of Varna. We don't have a priestly caste. There are no Brahmins. A Dalit can become head Granthi of Darbar Sahib. So there is no untouchability in kind of everyday life, and there is no religious prescription. Actually, the religious prescriptions are against the caste system, against practice of untouchability, against practice of hierarchy, against practice of avoidance. That's why we have things like langar and sangat and pangat. All those things were meant to kind of erase caste, but the reality of caste exists. So it raises several questions. One is that yes, even when you kind of take out the faith aspect of it, some aspect of caste would remain. So caste is also about what we describe as materialities, about resources, who has land, who has resources, who has other kind of, what in social sciences we call as various kinds of capital. And the kinds of second point is that caste is a form of inequality. The word caste is obviously not an Indian word. Not that we don't have words which would describe, say, jati or varna or stuff like that. But jati and varna is specific to Hinduism. In Punjab, we do have Zat and Biradris. Again, if you look at the lived Hinduism, every region would have a language which would correspond to something like caste. So I think the term caste can be used in a wider context. Comparatively, one can also think of American racial hierarchies as caste system. One can also think about inequalities in Japan, Barakuman system, or in Thailand or other parts of the world as a kind of caste, which is not necessarily class. I think that's a good way to. So class is about simply economic relationships. Caste is about status hierarchies, about uch neech, somebody who is considered as superior, inferior, just because of their identity. So caste is ascription-based identity which institutionalizes some practices of humiliation, where you humiliate some people and in the process you produce certain kind of power relations. So we are trying to define caste in a slightly more complicated manner. That is the main point. But at the same time, I think the point that you are making about the modernity of caste also is very critical, because this is generally misunderstood in the sense that people from, say, right-wing Hindu position would also say that, caste is not an Indian reality. The British brought it. That's not true at all. I mean, caste has existed. If Nanak is talking about caste in the 15th century, obviously he's talking about something that was there in the 15th century before British came. If the Kabir is talking about caste, if Ravidas is talking about Begumpura, they were talking about these realities of hierarchy and untouchability, and Manusmriti is a reality. So there is a reality of caste which exists historically for a very long time, but at the same time, as a living reality, as a material reality, as something which lives on, even if you don't have religious prescription for it, it also then undergoes change all the time. Even within so-called Hinduism also it is undergoing change. During the colonial period, for example, when social reformers begin to talk about a reformed Hinduism, a Hinduism which would be like Christianity or Islam as a grand religion with central text and with some kind of symbols. So obviously the reality of life changes. When the state introduces quota system, reservations, you have a new category emerging, and that category then remobilizes itself, reframes itself as Dalit or OBC. That is also changing the reality of caste, where people begin to connect from, say, Kerala to Bengal, from Bengal to Gujarat. So there is a kind of notion. Otherwise, the reality of caste as it is lived and experienced, it's very local. It is very localized. Like Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay is a name that is typically Bengali, and there is Bengali hierarchy, and those names don't exist in Punjab.
and
Those
and, and, the,
identities
and the
exist in
surname
Punjab.
and a surname, whether I like it or not, it actually gives me a very Brahminical tag,
Yeah,
So,
obviously, yeah.
so
So obviously, the identities which people very proudly claim, even though
yeah,
publicly you would say I'm anti-caste, but at the
yeah,
same
but
time you're comfortable with your name, and why should you not be? Because that is your
correct.
name. I mean, how can you get away from it? So it's not something that we can individually say that I'm kind of free of caste. All of us at some level are all the time
Yes,
living in that system of caste.
I
Along
remember
with that,
I just wanted to, we're talking about, I just suddenly remembered a flash in the memory. The first time I grew up in a family, with parents, who actually did not believe in the caste system. So for me, Mukhopadhyay was, as you said, just a name.
yeah,
It was not an identity tag. The first time I realized it when I went to interview. This is sometime towards the late 1980s. The late Kanshi Ram, who was at that point, beginning to emerge as an important voice on national politics. The Bahujan Samaj Party had contested one or two elections. Mayawati had contested her first election from Bijnor, in a by-election Lok Sabha, which was won by Ramvilas Paswan, lost by Meera Kumar. And so the first time I went and he asked my name, I just gave my name, the first name. So he asked, what is the surname? I told my surname also, and then he gave me a kind of a knowing look, and there was a very wry smile on his face. That is the first time when I became a conscious of a caste identity, which actually gives me a certain label, and then realize that how the people who are actually considered to be, underprivileged or from the the lower sections of caste, how they would be feeling all the time, right from the time that they develop consciousness till the end. Now, the second point which I wanted, you talked about casteism, Manusmriti and that, there are large number of, scholars and also leaders. Gandhi, for instance, was of the opinion that, Manusmriti, or, what really came out, caste was really not hierarchy. It was more about, various other things, but definitely it was not a power, not specifying a power equation, which, a lot of people, of course, disagree with. You talked about caste in Sikhism. That is the first time. In the 80s is the time when Punjab was very turbulent, and as journalists, we were the first ones, going there, and that is the first time in our life we actually confronted the existence of caste within Sikhism. Living in Delhi and in North India, our primary exchange, in terms of cultural or social exchanges, were with the Sikhs. Either just ordinary citizens, or maybe our friends, or teachers in the university or in colleges, were people who were from what is called the upper caste. Now, similarly, just like that, you have a certain amount of the scheduled castes within the Sikh community. You also have scheduled caste among the Muslims. You also have a fair amount of caste order within the entire Muslim society. Dalit Christians is another very harsh reality. So is this really, how does one explain this? That's a better way of actually asking me a question. That Hindu influence on Islam and Christianity and also Sikhism, as you pointed out. So has it also spilled over into Hinduism having some kind of an influence on Islam and Christianity to be able to make it also as hierarchical and caste divided on caste lines?
that's the popular view, and we have tried to contest this view, right? This view of India being a land of Hindus, everyone who lives here at
Hmm.
one time, he or she was a Hindu, and then they become Muslims or Christians.
Right.
So there's a conversion out of Hinduism. This is a myth that was produced by partly by the colonial kind of writings, but also then, in some sense, popularized by the nationalists that India is a land of Hindus. But then Hinduism means that Hindus are all Brahminical Hindus, right? So there is a
Right.
particular kind of hierarchy in which. So the word Hinduism has been in existence for a very long time. But if you were to actually look at the history of hierarchy, as you were saying, that Gandhi claimed that there was there was no hierarchy, which
Yes.
is empirically not the case, right? Even in the ancient times, you have what we call, as the historians would call, as Shramanic traditions. I mean, Buddhism was also in some sense anti-Brahminical hierarchies. So Brahminical hierarchies were to begin with structures of power, structures of exclusion. They were designed as castes. Caste means to humiliate somebody and to kind of establish relationships of power. So caste, the moment you think about caste, then it has to be a kind of system of hierarchy which in some sense is built on some structures of inequality, which is supported by humiliation, by untouchability and stuff like that. Otherwise it will be class system, right? When we talk about division of labor and stuff like that, then it is not caste. So if the caste exists, if there is a Brahmin and if there is an untouchable, that means there is caste system, and this is a different kind of inequality. So
Sorry, please continue. Sorry.
go ahead.
No, please, I will come back to it.
When we talk about, say, the category scheduled caste is an official classification which was during the colonial period, and later on then it is constitutionalized. So the word scheduled caste applied only to the Hindus. Then the Sikh reformers or Sikh nationalists who were part of the Constituent Assembly, they argued that we also have our Dalits and we would like them to also gain from the reservation policy, so include them in the list of scheduled castes. And then there was kind of a lot of argument, and eventually they were able to push their case through. New Buddhists who were converts out of Buddhism, the Mahars of Maharashtra, were included in the list only in 1991. So the category scheduled caste was given only to the Hindus because of this myth that caste is a Hindu religious system, which it is and it is not. So you do have hierarchies among Muslims, but Muslim hierarchies are Muslim hierarchies. They are not the Zat Biradaris of the Hindus, right? So there are particular names and titles, for example, sheikhs, and so they are elite Muslims. Sayyids. Sheikhs and Sayyids are not Brahmins. Sheikhs and Sayyids are Sheikhs and Sayyids, right? So their hierarchies are like castes, but they are not the Hindu jatis, right? So they also don't call themselves jatis. So the point that we are trying to make is that we need to recognize that there are pluralities of caste system within India, not only across different religious faith systems, but also across regions. So in Tamil Nadu, for example, or in Kerala, for example, you don't have anybody who would identify themselves as Kshatriya, right? So that Varna doesn't exist. So Rajputs exist mostly only in Rajasthan and a few other places. So that is very central to the idea of Hindu notion of hierarchy. I don't know who is Rajput in Bengal, but these categories become popular only when colonial rulers introduce census system and they begin to enumerate population on the basis of the notion of Varna. So Varna is not something that exists on ground. What exists on ground are different kinds of clusters in every region. There would be different kind of jatis, or they have localized names. And Varna is just an ideological construct, which in some sense, for the Hindu kind of theological system, produces a justification for hierarchy. Not that the category Varna is irrelevant, but it is not an empirical reality. So among Sikhs, for example, you talk about Jats, which are the Jat Sikhs or whatever we call them. So they are the most important community within the religious system of the Sikhs because of political power. In a village in Punjab, they would be the highest, but they are not ritually highest, right? They are not placeable in the Varna hierarchy. So the the traditional upper castes of Punjab would be Khatris. Now, who are Khatris? Are they Brahmins? No, they are not Brahmins. Are they Kshatriyas? No, they are not Kshatriyas. So what are they? They are Khatris.
Right? Pardon? That is what popularly understood, that they are part of the trading community.
The trading communities, but they have traditionally also been the cultured elites of Punjab. All the Sikh gurus were also Khatris. So Khatri means they are businessmen, but they are only in cities. In villages, Khatris have no place. If you are a Khatri in a village, you are not considered as the topmost, right? So Brahmin in village of Punjab is considered like a Dalit who performs some services for some alms. So you would find these realities changing from region to region, where different communities have different kinds of positions, and those positions are not pan-Indian positions. So there's a variety of structures of hierarchy, and to superimpose a kind of universal notion of Hinduism, where either you are Hindu or you convert out of Hindu, is a kind of nationalist, orientalist conspiracy. which is obviously very convenient for certain kind of political ideologies even today, because they want to produce a united India, but on the
Yes.
basis of certain notions. But those
On the
notions have certain kind of
issue of
uh,
religious
yeah,
identity, I
yeah,
think. There is, you talked about different regions. Now, people in North India, till the time caste became an important political issues, did not really understand caste. Of course, there was there for social relations in terms of marriages, in terms of sharing a meal together, especially among the elite, the higher caste among the Hindus. They wouldn't have a meal with the people who were scheduled caste, who were, those kind of social ostracism was very common. We have grown up with those sentiments. I grew up in North India, so I grew up with all that. Now, Southern India, when we became journalists in 1980, when we first started hearing the whispers of caste being an important issue, without really having the wherewithal at that stage to be able to understand what is this and how is it going to play out in politics. The first thing that people in North India heard was that South Indians and people in South India, especially Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, to a great extent have resolved their caste issues a long time ago. The politics of reservation has played out in Tamil Nadu and other states for a long time, for several decades prior to this, and then rooting it down to the social justice movement, through from the early century decades of the 20th century. Now, as somebody who has studied that how do you think that it's very distinct in southern India compared to what we see in north and the western India, which is like one huge block of caste based politics and the trends of politics?
I would say within South also there are different trajectories of the manner in which caste identities change. For example, Tamil Nadu is the only region where you had very strong non-Brahmin communities emerge as mobilized caste clusters. But this was also the region where Brahmins were very powerful. Brahmins were not only ritually superior, they also
Also
owned
very
land.
exploitative, if I can, ask you that, were they also very exploitative along with being very superior, and that is
Yes,
what
they were
actually
also, yeah, yeah. So
huge
they were
amount of
generally owners of all the agricultural land. So they were landlords in the villages, and the so-called backward castes were their tenants. So there were generally three categories: the Brahmins, non-Brahmins, and the Dalits. Non-Brahmins were obviously the ones that we would now describe as OBCs. So, but the trajectory of Kerala is very different from Tamil Nadu.
that's right.
Trajectory of Telangana is very different from Tamil Nadu. Likewise, within Andhra Pradesh also, for example, the old Andhra Pradesh, Andhra region, the current Andhra Pradesh and Telangana have very different kind of trajectories, different kind of communities. The Hyderabad Nizam had a kind of different cultural history, so that also plays a role. Likewise, in Karnataka, you have Mysore region, you have other regions. So it depends on the kind of social movements that emerge in different regions. In Kerala, you have Narayan Gurus, and Narayan Guru plays a very important role in kind of raising questions of caste, right? So the Nayar Namudri grammar is very different from the Brahmin non-Brahmin kind of caste politics. So every region within South also, we have a kind of stereotypical in North India notion of thinking of South either through Chennai or through kind of Tamil Nadu's kind of political trajectory. So likewise in North India also, if you look at historically, in 1920s, Punjab saw a very vibrant Dalit political movement called Aad Dharam movement, and Aad Dharam movement produced significant mobility among the Ravidasis of Chamar, Ravidasis of Doaba region. Likewise in UP also, in some areas Dalit mobilizations were there. Bengal was a different region. Some areas where left, in some sense, replaced any kind of radical politics, and left thought that it's better not to talk about caste. So, but that does not mean that the Bhadralok was not caste privilege section, right? Bhadralok was also caste privilege section, and it was convenient for it to not talk about caste, because the moment you talk about caste, then there would be other kind of problems emerging.
Even within the elite Brahmins, there were two different categories of Brahmins, in Bengal. And marriages across these, the types of Brahmins, was also prohibited. That is something which is very significant, and we find it region to region differing. Now,
The other point I want to make is it's not only about ritual life. It's not only about cultural practices. It also translated in various kinds of institutionalized violences. For example,
Right.
ownership over land. So one may not encounter those things, but if you go to to a village of Bengal in 1970s or 1980s or even in 1990s, after land reforms and left front is in power, you would find certain structures of power which would correspond with caste hierarchies, right? These are things
Right.
that have existed, and there is empirical work also to report on that. But it was not talked about. It was not talked about in the language of caste because there was a kind of left hegemony, and left hegemony was, it also produced many positive results because it then kind of gives a new language to citizenship. But the point is that those identities, if you ask a Dalit in Bengal, they would
Hmm.
immediately say, no, we always felt humiliated. It was not like
Yes.
we did not feel even there. So I think there was this kind of, so every region had its own dynamics. And if you look at, Bihar history, you have those Senas and the left movement, the ML movement also has a kind of caste angle to it. So the kind of violence that you had, it was directly caste violence. So it did not get talked about in the manner in which we talk about today with the rise of Dalit and OBC politics. Obviously, the language around caste and politics changes. But if you look at the subtle level of ownerships of over land, everyday life, politics, as well as questions of rights and who would represent whom, who would speak for whom, you would see all those things happening all the time. But it's also changing. The moment you have official classification OBC coming in 1990s, the grammar of caste changes, equations change, and that is when in some sense it becomes legitimate, or it becomes in some sense
You know,
necessary to talk about caste as well.
right. This is where actually I, need to just, just ask you something which is very important. You talk about 1990s. Just before that, a brief little thing. When you were talking about Bengal and large number of people who are Dalits there. Almost every region in India, I feel, after having seen and being a reporter, on the field, traveling to various parts of the country, every region has numerous untold stories of persecution and exploitations on the basis of caste identity, which are yet to be written in India. So there's a lot of more work and documentation, further studies to be done. Now, as far as the dominant region of India is concerned, because of the numerical strength, both within parliament and within, in terms of the population also, which may further increase with 2026 pending delimitation, the North and the Western India being more further represented in Indian Parliament. Those worries hanging in the air. 1990s is the time when because of certain political compulsions, Vishwanath Pratap Singh resurrects the long lying, forgotten Mandal Commission report and says that this is going to be implemented. And the OBCs become a political category in electoral politics for the first time. That completely upsets at that point the Hindutva forces led by the BJP and its leader, Mr. L.K. Advani, who felt that the pan-Hindu identity which had been forged through the Ram Janmabhoomi, Ayodhya agitation from 1984 to 1990 was getting frittered away. So to unite that, they decided to launch the Rath Yatra from Somnath to Ayodhya, which got stopped, and the rest of it is history. And within a few weeks we are actually going to see a very a milestone event which means differently for different sections of Indians. Some would be very jubilant, and there would be a huge amount, a large number of Hindus who would not share that jubilance. That sense is going to be there. So this entire issue of Mandal versus Kamandal, it is being played out once again, though not in the latest round of elections, but there is this constant mention that caste-based census or survey, which has been, the survey was conducted by the Bihar government earlier in 2023, and it has been promised by the Congress and a few other political parties if they ever come to a position where they can actually decide the national policies of the country. So first is the question of the census and caste. Till 1931, it was part of census enumeration. After that, it was not. And if it again, once again, becomes part of the census, how is it going to really play out in terms of real politics, in terms of electoral behavior of people? Will they vote as jatis or will they vote as Hindus on the basis of a Ram Temple agitation, or are they going to just vote as civic citizens on issues of livelihood concerns?
See, I'm not a political analyst. Just kind of a couple of things that I would say.
Having
Yeah,
interacted and
yeah,
studied,
yeah. So
I'm
there are
not
two, three.
asking in
Yeah,
any case to
there,
give a
yeah.
forecast.
No, there are two, three things underlying this discussion. I think the questions are very, very critical, and we must engage with them. First of all, that all of us all the time have multiple identities, right?
Right.
We have caste identities, we also have our religious identities, we also have professional identities, we have gender identities, we have other kind of regional identities. So
Right.
how do they get configured at a particular context depends on various other factors. So nobody can assume that now Hindutva identity has become so
The dom-
hegemonic, now caste is erased. That is not the case. Caste remains a reality, right? Caste has not gone away, but the reality is also that every caste group is getting internally differentiated, right? So you won't find a single jati which would not have a small middle class of its own. So those middle class individuals would also represent that caste, but at the same time there is also distancing, there is also aspiration, there is also loneliness, all kinds of things are there. But caste identities are very, very significant and they remain. Likewise, to say that since caste is there, religious identity will be forgotten, that is also not the case. We have seen that people from all kind of communities, marginalized groups, they choose to identify with a kind of religious identity, and we need to, in some sense, this is challenge for us to say that it is their stupidity or false consciousness. I think that's a lazy kind of explanation. But the reality is that people have different identities. How which identity would suddenly emerge, for example, in regions like Bengal and Punjab, regional identities are also very strong. I mean, how they play out in politics, one doesn't really know when they will emerge, one doesn't. So these are all identities which are kind of part of everyday life, and they would play out in politics. So one doesn't know how. That's where political leadership becomes very critical. That's where also the larger context of politics and culture becomes very critical, and various other kind of interests like corporate capital and money, they all in some sense have a role to play. So how will it play out is not something that I can say anything. You would perhaps know much better than me. But there's another level where when we are talking about caste census, what is its intended purpose? If we were to think of it honestly, intended purpose is to engage with the reality of caste deprivations. Does it
Right.
help in that? The answer is yes. How does it help? It helps in two, three different ways. One, it exposes privilege, right? The question that Kashiram asked you, you felt uncomfortable because we take it for granted that we are not really, in some sense, talking about caste. Why are you asking my caste, right? So that is, in some sense, a question which exposes and makes us realize that we are also inside the caste system. We are privileged because of that. We are never identified by our caste identity, and they are to identify by us by our caste identity, therefore placing us as a particular rather than as universal as we would like to place ourselves as.
Right.
So one thing is it exposes privilege. Second, I think if we have to deal with caste-based inequalities, we need to reimagine reservation as an active process, not as a kind of passive process. You identify certain communities and give them quotas forever. So I think we need to have localized regional level engagements with the empirical realities of caste. And for that, we need data. We need data constant. No modern state can function without lot of data. We need community-wise data. We need region-wise data. We need sub-community-wise data. We need data on mobility, who is going out, who is coming in. We don't need to reserve everyone for all the time.
I simply cannot at this point, when you talk about we need more data, cannot but interrupt you and say that what a tragedy that we are in 2023, the last few weeks and days of the year, and we still do not have any work done on the 2021 census. The government certainly does not seem to be prioritizing it. Been put, and the absence of data is going to create havoc, but possibly it helps their politics to get further. Sorry to interrupt, but yes, Professor Jodhka, please continue what you were saying.
Precisely the point that you made. So data is politics. Data is not something which is just question of numbers, and so data would tell us which sub-community. So this is not a question that is being raised by individuals like me from above. It has come up from within those communities, like some classification. It's a genuine. I've studied that process, and if you go to Punjab, there are certain one or two communities which have taken away all the privileged positions, even though there is subclassification in Punjab already. But if you look at the central government jobs, there are only just one or two communities which have like 90% plus positions. Likewise, in Andhra Pradesh, you have this, Mala Madika controversy. In Maharashtra, you have Mahars versus Charamkars and stuff like that. So every region, every category. So these are official interventions. Affirmative action is not a kind of privilege which you inherit and it should not be touched. So these are official interventions, and we need to see that people who have already benefited after 3 generation, 4 generation, as categories, as subcategories of those categories are taken out so that others can come in. And also, in some sense, it needs to be seen for the general narratives of citizenship. That when we think about citizenship, citizenship is not simply a question of gender. Likewise, the questions of other identities also needs to be confronted upfront. We are going in just in the opposite direction. We are producing new categories of Dalit by identifying them as minorities and stuff like that. For me, the word minority is nonsense. I mean, we should not use the word minority, because when we are saying democratic citizenship, we are talking about democratic citizenship where everyone is equal. So in order to produce equality, if there is institutionalized inequality, the affirmative action was supposed to kind of bridge that gap. For that, you need constant data. So India has moved quite a lot. I mean, if you look at Dalit movement today, it has happened because of the quota middle class. So we have progressed a lot. So question of caste is not what it used to be even 30 years back. Today, if you have small case of violence, it gets highlighted, and there are people who would create ruckus. And we have seen in Maharashtra, in Punjab, whenever there is a big movement, big case of violence, it becomes a big issue politically. And that is a big thing for Indian democracy to kind of congratulate itself. So for that, we need to constantly engage honestly.
So, Professor Jodhka, one last question. We are actually, reaching the end, how much we can actually discuss. One last question. Can one say that today Indians are much more conscious, and many more Indians are conscious, both in terms of numerically as well as in terms of, intensity, of the caste issue compared to the past, that class identity is not the only thing. There is also a caste identity. An example being that the Communist parties of India, even though they are electorally very irrelevant, but their supporters within the intellectual world are today much more, they recognize the existence of caste than what was done before. There was a time when the two communist parties did not, accept the existence of caste. Everything was class driven as far as their political understanding and views were concerned. So can one say that it is a far greater amount, far greater reality numerically as well as in intensity, and for that we got to have more and more specific data which must be recorded and put in the public domain by the government of whichever party it is.
Thank you for asking this question. So this brings us back to this book, right? The fact that this book has been published by Oxford University Press, it was published in UK first. It's a global handbook. It's not handbook on India, and people who are working on caste is also. So it also shows that the question of caste is being institutionalized in the Indian academy and in the global academy, right? In US, when I was in US last April, every university was talking about caste because there was a new legislation and they needed to take a position on that. So there is a kind of, you're absolutely right. Even if we wish to say that I don't want to talk about caste, you will be identified by your caste, I mean, who you are. And that is something which in some sense is not necessarily bad. We need to engage with our own realities. Otherwise, somebody else will engage with those realities, and then we will be in some sense. So we need data, but we also need analysis. We also need engagement theoretically. That's why this book is very critical. That where does the word come from? What did colonial rule do? What did Mughal rule do to caste? What the official policies are doing today? How migrations are changing caste. First, we thought that caste was only rural, but it is in the urban context that the caste gets mobilized. So all the caste leadership, all the new engagement with caste happen in the city. So it's a city from where caste is kind of become political, not from the village. Village people have always kind of been divided on caste, but when we think of national level politics, so at the global level now, caste is very significant, and universities in US or UK or otherwise also, there are Dalit networks operating everywhere. So I think that awareness is very critical. Some people would say it is very undesirable because it unnecessarily obsesses us with something that we should not talk about. There is a point in that as well, but I think that is just to kind of avoid the dirt in your house and say that it doesn't exist. So we need to talk about it and we need to expose it so that we can clean it, right? Not to live
We
with
need,
caste, clean it.
yeah, we need to talk about and recognize the imperfections, the many imperfections which are there in Indian society. And thank you, Professor Jodhka, for this very enlightening conversation. As you said, that it is very important for us to generate a lot of data and analysis, while analysis and also a lot of perspective. Uh, we definitely, either you or me individually cannot in any way contribute to generating data. That has to be decided by the government of the day. But definitely in terms of analysis and in terms of throwing perspective, historically as well as within the contemporary period, you have done a lot and shared a lot of it on this particular conversation with me. And thank you very much, Professor Jyotka. It's been wonderful to converse with you once again after a fairly long gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.